have a very special episode. It isn't about recipes, it's about memories, hunger, stories. People say love is the universal language, but no, it's food. Food that takes 2 days to roast in the ground. Food you gather with cedar sticks from a canoe. Food you leach for days in running water just to make it edible. And don't worry, I'm not going to make you scroll through 15 paragraphs of how my grandma met a bear in the woods before you get to the acorn pancake recipe. I'm not here to give you perfect measurements. I'm here to remind you that people already had them, thousands of years ago. And some still do. And they taste pretty much like they always have. This is Stratified, and you're listening to Kitchen Cultures. My name's Lindsay, and before I was an archaeologist, I was a cook. I've cooked in fast food restaurants, cramped hotel lines, Michelin star kitchens. I've worked the line at 2 a.m. I've deglazed with cognac while my chef screamed in Japanese. But nothing prepared me for cooking in the dirt, for grinding seeds by hand, for waiting over 24 hours for an agave heart to finish roasting underground. Because it turns out, when you take away the sous vide machines and $300 knives and trade them for a pit, a flat rock, and your own knees, you learn things. In this episode, I tried some of the old ways. The really old ways. And let me tell you, burning your fingertips on hot stone ground matzah is a different kind of culinary education. You'll hear anecdotes and reflections from these experiments throughout this episode. The textures, the smoke, the moments that went right, and the ones that made me reconsider every decision that led me to baking a cornmeal next to a creek like some kind of feral squirrel. Because archaeology isn't just about what people used to eat, it's about what it felt like to make it, to mess it up, to taste history, sour, bitter, burned, perfect. And honestly, this is what I love about archaeology. Because we like to think we've changed so much. We have smartphones, driverless cars, AI making salad dressing recommendations. But when you dig your hands into the ground to light a fire or crush dried corn with a rock, it becomes obvious. What we do with food hasn't changed all that much. We still bake and braise and broil. We roast, we fry, we ferment and simmer and share. Sure, the tools look sleeker, the kitchens are flashier, but the rhythms, the instincts, the methods and recipes, the drive to cook something that feeds more than just an empty stomach, that's still with us. And if archaeology teaches us anything, it's this. Why we eat what we eat today isn't about survival. It's about memory and love and satisfaction. That's the part that sticks around. What fire brought to the table. Fire gets a bad rap, especially in the West. We call it destructive, dangerous, something to suppress. But in indigenous food systems, fire wasn't chaos. It was a chef in and of itself. It made flavor, it made abundance, it made dinner possible. Across California, Oregon, the Great Plains, and beyond, communities used low, controlled burns to cultivate food. And I don't mean metaphorically. I mean fire literally grew food. First course, berries. Low fires moved through huckleberry fields and blackberry patches, clearing the underbrush and enriching the soil with ash. In a few months, the new growth would explode. Sweeter, thicker, easier to harvest. Archaeologists have found layers of charred berry seeds, hearths full of carbonized fruit. These fires weren't accidents. They were recipes written into the landscape. Some still have this perception that indigenous folks were just hunting and gathering. But please understand that this wasn't some random or lucky foraging. These were tended gardens. Families returned to the same patches for generations. Knowing your great-grandmother's pie came from a bush she burned 15 years ago, on purpose, that's pretty cool. Then you have the oaks. Acorns fed entire nations. From California to the southeast, fire kept the pests down, opened sunlight, and encouraged strong yields. And when we find burned acorns and shell middens, grinding stones worn smooth, We're seeing the bones of a meal that started in flame. But my favorite fire-made food? Camas. Camas bulbs, those gorgeous blue meadowy flowers, were a prized carbohydrate in the Northwest and Plateau regions. But they're a little hard to digest raw. So, what did people do? They slow roasted them in earth ovens for 24 to 48 hours. It broke down the inulin into sweet, sticky sugars. Think about caramelized onions. You wouldn't just take a bite out of a raw, sweet onion. At least I hope you wouldn't. No, you'd let them cook low and slow until they caramelize with their own natural sugars. That's all it takes. The right kind of heat and some patience. Your reward? Sweet, earthy, and deeply filling. We find these pits today. Fire-cracked rocks, carbonized bulbs, blackened soils, and every one of them tells us someone stood here and cooked underground. For days. For a feast. Fire didn't just make food edible. It made it delicious, predictable, worth gathering for. Fire turned landscapes into larders. It wasn't destruction, it was dinner. Earth ovens are the original slow cooker. Giant pits lined with hot stones, covered with plants and soil, then left to do their own thing. Sometimes overnight, sometimes for days. And what came out? Sticky, smoky, caramelized perfection. Let's talk camas again. Because after fire made it grow, the earth made it sing. Communities from Idaho to British Columbia built massive roasting pits to slow-cook camas bulbs in bulk. Archaeologists find layers of burned rocks, carbonized roots, and soil turned black from centuries of feasting. And this wasn't necessarily everyday food. This was gathering time food, ceremony food, the kind of food that fed 200 people. Now, let's shift into the Southwest. Agave. Same idea, different plant. Agave hearts were roasted in pits for up to 3 days. The result? A sticky, smoky, low-key dessert you can walk across the desert with. When done right, roasted agave tastes like a sweet potato, caramel, and survival. In the plains, prairie turnips and wild onions were roasted, then dried for travel. And like any good line or prep cook will tell you today, nothing was wasted. And in their own way, every pit is a time capsule. They tell you what was growing, who came to eat it, how far they carried it afterwards. As a former cook, I'll tell you this. No amount of sous vide or salamanders can beat a 48-hour underground roast in a pit filled with river stones and intention, period. And if you're in Texas, this isn't just a theory, it's a legacy. Earth ovens are everywhere beneath our feet. On rocky ridgelines, river terraces, rock shelters, in dry brush under mesquite and prickly pear. Archaeologists have uncovered burned rock middens, massive stone cooking features, sometimes over 30 feet wide and 3 feet deep, with evidence of la chiquilla, sotol, and even prickly pear being slow roasted for hours, even days. And these rocks weren't just tossed in at random. They were chosen for their thermal properties, cleaned, heated, and often reused. We know this because some of the middens contain thousands of fractured fire-cracked rocks. Layers upon layers of heat, grease, and stone. This wasn't a backyard barbecue. This was a calendar event. A labor-sharing, resource-saving, community-wide culinary operation. And it still works. I've tried it. I've pulled sotol hearts out of the coals after 36 hours, wrapped in agave leaves and still steaming. The taste? Somewhere between a sweet potato, an artichoke, and wood smoke. Strange, but weirdly familiar. It's the flavor that makes you feel like you've eaten it before, even if you haven't. And earth ovens don't just tell you what people ate. They tell you how long they stayed, how many came, how many returned. Because you don't build a feature like this unless you're planning to feed more than just a few people. When you think of water and food, fishing is probably the first thing that comes to mind. But water wasn't just used for fishing. In many indigenous food systems, it was engineered carefully over generations. Let's start with clam gardens, stone-walled tidal terraces along the Pacific Northwest. These weren't wild beds. They were designed to trap sediment and create ideal habitats for clams. More clams, bigger clams, less effort. Archaeologists have found some that are over 3,500 years old, layered with butter clam shells, stone tools nearby, with midden mounds as high as houses. This was aquaculture, and it was delicious. Now, let's move a bit inland. Fish weirs. V-shaped or circular barriers built across rivers to direct spawning fish, especially salmon, into baskets or spears, built from stone or wood or woven willow, some with carved markers for ceremony, because fishing was never just about eating. It was a relationship. These fish weren't fried on the riverbank. Well, probably not. They were dried, smoked, stored in hide bags, buried in pits, fermented into pastes, made into jerky. And we find the traces. Charred salmon bones, hearths blackened with oil, drying racks built into settlement walls. And then there's wild rice. Wild rice isn't rice as we know it today. It's grass, a stubborn, waving, river-dwelling grass that sings when you paddle through it. In Ojibwe, it's called manumin, the good seed. You don't plant rice, you tend it. You paddle out in pairs. One person guiding the canoe, the other gently tapping the ripe heads with cedar sticks. The grains fall into the canoe, some fall into the water, and that's the point. Then it's parched over fire, winnowed in bark trays and stored. We've found wild rice in storage pits, burned grains in hearths, even impressions left in pottery. I watched wild rice being parched over flame in a birch bark tray. It cracked and popped like popcorn, smelled like nutty wood smoke and lake air. When I cooked it, just with water and a little fat, it opened slowly, curling like tiny canoes. The flavor, toasty, deep, a little floral. And in Texas, places like Katy were rice country too. Flat, flood-prone, and nutrient-rich. And before the commercial fields, there were native grains, wild greens, and edible roots tucked into marshy edges. What feeds us has layers. Air doesn't get enough credit in the kitchen. But if you've ever worked in a smokehouse, you know that air is a key ingredient. It dries, it preserves, it moves food from now to later. Start with pemmican, a food so efficient it almost shouldn't be possible. Dried bison meat, rendered fat, crushed berries, sometimes a little marrow, maybe some seeds, stored in hide sacks, carried for months, traded across the continent. We find the tools, the pits, the scrapers, the stone knives stained red. Pemmican wasn't survival food. It was strategy food, power food, portable legacy, the OG energy bar. And people, hunters, climbers, hikers, are still making and eating it today. Salmon, same deal. Split open, hung on racks, dried in the open air, or smoked low and slow over a cedar. Not just for taste, though it tasted amazing, but for storage. Because preservation was preparation. It meant that your kids ate in February. And seeds, sunflower, amaranth, corn. Seeds were sorted, dried, saved. They weren't scattered randomly. They were bundled, named, carried. And in the Southeast, especially in Mississippian societies, food storage was everything. Granaries, clay-lined pits, charred corn caches buried beneath platform mounds. These were everyday pantries and safety nets. A statement that said, we're staying. The Mississippians grew corn, beans, and squash, sure, but also sumpweed, goosefoot, maygrass. ancient cultivars that fed hundreds, if not thousands, long before the arrival of European crops. The Choctaw still cook with many of these things today. Wild onions and eggs pan-fried in a cast iron skillet, if you know you know. Hominy made from stone-ground corn soaked in lye. Thick stews boiled, slowly poured over rice or cornbread. Dried meat cooked down with river greens until the broth turns dark and rich and healing. These recipes may not have been passed down on note cards, but they're passed down in method, in memory, in smell, in rhythm, in knowing when something's done by the way the steam smells, not by a timer, which, not surprisingly, is how the greatest cooks operate today. Everything is to taste. Preservation wasn't a backup plan. It was the plan. Air moved food, kept it, let it travel. Air turned harvests into hope. Now let's move deeper into staple foods. Yes, corn is a crop, but it's also a cornerstone. From Mesoamerica to the eastern woodlands, from the southwest to the edges of Canada, corn built calendars, cities, trade routes, and family lines. It fed empires. It fed ceremonies. It still feeds most of the Western Hemisphere today, even if we pretend it doesn't. But early corn, it wasn't sweet, it wasn't soft, and it definitely didn't come frozen in a bag. If you want to understand corn the way the ancestors did, you have to nixtamalize it. You don't know how happy I am to finally get to use that word in a sentence, out loud. You soak dried kernels in water mixed with wood, ash, or lye. It smells like smoke and old soap. The skin slips off. The bitterness lifts. The niacin unlocks. Suddenly, you have nutrition. You have masa. I've tried it. Nixtamalizing with ash. My hands burned a little. The water turned milky, then gray. The corn softened into something that smelled and felt like warm clay and summer grass. I ground it by hand on a metate until it turned into masa. Soft, sticky, dense. I shaped it into a lousy-looking banaha and steamed it, wrapped in a husk over fire. When I took a bite, it didn't taste like anything store-bought. It tasted alive, deep, layered, like something that had waited a long time to be tasted properly. Then again, I tend to romanticize things, especially after a margarita or two, but you try it and let me know. But yeah, corn was never just filler, it was faith. You tend it, talk to it, sing to it, roast it, pop it, boil it, store it in clay jars, and pass it down across generations.
You can barbecue it, boil it, broil it, bake it, saute it. There's shrimp kebabs.
Corn is a memory with roots, and it's still growing. In archaeological sites across the Southwest, the Great Plains, the Southeast, beans show up in hearths, in storage pits, in trade bundles carried across miles at a time. You've got tapeberry beans, scarlet runners, lima beans, pinto adjacent beans, varietals with names you've never heard of, and flavors your tongue barely remembers. In Mississippian societies, beans were a powerhouse. Cooked with hominy into thick stews, mashed and fried into cakes, simmered with fat, served with greens, wild onions, smoked fish, and even berries. Beans were what you came home to. You want a taste? Get yourself some heirloom beans, stick them in a clay pot over fire, soak overnight, simmered with nothing but water, wild onion, and a pinch of ash. The smell? Sweet, savory, like warm stone and dirt in spring. I know you know the smell. They split open slowly, swell, thicken the broth into something substantial, an emulsifier. When you taste it, you'll get it. Beans aren't filler. They're glue. They're fuel. They're comfort disguised as economy. Beans don't brag. They show up quietly, faithfully, deliciously. And in every culture that planted them, harvested them, and stored them for winter, they're still showing up. And in this economy, I recommend you learn a legume recipe or two. Squash, the guardian of the ground. Corn gets the praise, beans get the credit, but squash? Squash was the bodyguard. It sprawled, it shaded, it smothered weeds. It held the soil together when the rains came late and the sun came hard. Squash was the rough and tough cousin who made sure everything else could thrive. Across indigenous North America, squash was food, but it was also strategy. Grown low between corn stalks and bean poles, it trapped moisture, blocked pests, and made sure the other crops could grow in peace. And when it was done protecting the field, it fed whole families. The archaeological record is full of squash. Hardened rinds used as bowls, rinds used as canteens, seeds roasted, flesh baked, mashed, dried into leather. Some varieties date back over 10,000 years in the Americas. Think about that. We've had squash longer than we've had cities. In the eastern woodlands, the southeast, even parts of Texas and the southwest, you find squash everywhere. And it wasn't just one kind. There were dozens of varieties. Curved, warty, striped, bulbous, buttery, dense. Each one adapted to its region. Each one beloved for something a little different. So maybe think about that before judging someone for their pumpkin spice lattes. Squash is also super easy to work with. If you're going the experimental archaeology route, roast it in a shallow pit, bury it in coals and ash, and let it go for most of the day. When you dig it out, the rind should be half charred and the inside practically pudding. It doesn't need anything. No salt, no sugar, no garnish. Just a spoon and a moment. The flavor, like smoke met brown sugar and decided to raise a family. Man, now I'm thinking about savory ice cream. Like, picture this. Charred, caramelized squash with a scoop of mesquite bean ice cream. Sounds pretty good, right? Squash was strength food, survival food, celebration food. And like a lot of good things, it stayed low, hugged the dirt, held it together, fed everybody. Bison, blood, bone, and feast. You don't eat bison casually. You don't just fry it up and move on. A bison was a feast, a fortune, a full-body thank you. It took skill, risk. It took everything. And when you brought one down, you used all of it. Across the Great Plains, bison were more than meat. They were clothes, house walls, bowstrings, glue, tools, songs. The archaeological sites at bison jumps, massive kill sites where herds were driven off cliffs, are full of stories. Scattered bones, butchered long bones, fractured skulls, cooking stones cracked from heat. These weren't one-off meals. These were sometimes seasonal gatherings, whole communities coming together to process one life into hundreds of meals. The tongue was delicacy. The hump roast saved for elders. The marrow bones roasted and cracked open with stone tools. The stomach turned into a cooking vessel. The fat rendered into tallow. The blood boiled with herbs. And the other cuts? Dried, smoke, and sometimes pounded together with berries and fat into pemmican, a tasty insurance policy that could last years. Imagine cooking something that lasts longer than your lease. We're grilling bison burgers a little later today, but when I imagine cooking bison, I think about braising it, or roasting it low and slow over coals and willow branches, dry rubbed with ash and thyme, smoked until the fibers pull apart with a heavy breath, rich and wild. It's these moments when food feels like joining something, like becoming part of a line that stretches farther than the eye could see. It's not just sustenance, it's responsibility. Seasonings: smoke, ash, salt, and memory. Okay, so I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. There's this idea, this lazy, boring idea that food in ancient North America was bland. Like everyone was just gnawing on boiled roots and shrugging sadly. Let me be clear. They seasoned. Oh, they seasoned everything. They used smoke like marinade, not just for preservation, but for taste. Different woods for different meats. Cedar, juniper, mesquite, alder. Each one brought a different tone to the fire. They used ash, yes, ash, as seasoning. A pinch stirred into stews, mixed into cornmeal to soften its bite and open its nutrients, added for alkalinity, for flavor, for grounding. And salt? Yeah, no, they had salt. From salt caves and mineral springs, from evaporated lake beds to shallow marshes, boiled down in clay pots, traded in cakes. And then there were the real spices. Actual flavor bombs growing wild across the continent. Spicebush berries with a citrusy, peppery, bright flavor profile. Wild ginger, earthy and pungent, like the forest gave you whiplash. Bee balm, floral and minty. Think oregano's cooler, beaten-it cousin. Chili peppers in the southwest, bold, hot, traded long distance. Sumac, tart, crimson, stunning on roasted meats. Juniper berries, piney, resinous, used in meat rubs and teas. Sassafras, the original gumbo flavor, mind you. Wild mustard, sharp, peppery seeds used long before Dijon was a thing. These weren't afterthoughts. They were intentional. Gathered, dried, stored, steeped, rubbed on venison, stirred into broths, brewed into teas that burned a little on the way down and healed something deeper. If food doesn't taste good, taste right, you're doing it wrong. It doesn't matter what era you're coming from. Also, and I need to say this, every earth oven roast I've ever been to, hosted by archaeologists, the food is never seasoned. Like, I get it. Thank you for having me. Experimental archaeology is awesome, truly. But would it kill for you to experiment with some seasoning? Not even a whisper of salt. Not even a sad honorary onion. We all stand around pulling hot bulbs out of the ground like reverent little squirrels, nodding politely as we chew on something that tastes like hot, mushy root. Would people in the past have seasoned these? I think so. Probably, definitely. Maybe not with spice racks, but with ash, wild onion or garlic, maybe dried into a powder with sage leaf, with smoke. Maybe the leaves used to wrap the bulbs added flavor. Maybe they tossed in a handful of crushed berries here and there. Because flavor doesn't happen on accident. It's part of the planning. And flavor is so woven into memory. People remember taste vividly. It's intimate. It's nostalgic. And that's not just some recent phenomenon. Acorns, bread from the trees. Before there were fields, there were forests. And before grain mills, there were oaks. Acorns were bred before we even had a passport, and they fed nations. From California to the Carolinas, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, acorns were gathered, cracked, leached, ground, cooked, and stored. They weren't backup food. They were the main event. You don't collect hundreds of pounds of something unless you know what you're doing. And trust me, acorn processing is no joke. First, you gather, like a lot of acorns, like more than you're thinking of right now. Then you crack the shells by hand. Then you grind the nut meat with a stone until it turns into a coarse meal. Then you leach it over and over again, cold water pouring through, or submerged in a running creek for days. It's tedious. Your fingers become numb, your arms hurt, you question your choices. But the bitterness lifts, and the starch turns soft, and what's left behind smells like wet clay and fresh bread. You bake it into heavy loaves, steam it in clay pots, cook it in ashes, fry it if you're lucky enough to have fat. It's dense, nutty, and it sticks to your ribs. It stays with you. Acorns weren't for the faint-hearted. Yeah, maybe they were survival food, but they were also feast food, seasonal food, stored in baskets, lined in clay, layered in ash. Everyone who lived near oak groves knew the work and the payoff. And that's still around today. Desserts, sweets, and smoke-tinned treats. If you think indigenous North America didn't have dessert, you've never poured berry reduction over hot stones to make smoke syrup candy. Yeah, sure, there wasn't cane sugar or refined chocolate, but there were sap taps, roasted tubers, fermented berries, and honeycombs tucked into hollow trees. Dessert wasn't a separate course necessarily. It was built into the harvest. In the Southwest, roasted agave hearts. Sticky, dark, complex, like a burnt marshmallow grew up and got interesting. Prickly pear paddles roasted with agave, and the fruit, tuna, boiled into syrup so vibrantly red it stained your fingernails for days. It was tart, juicy, summer in a bottle. Some communities used it in drinks, others made candies, some just ate it fresh, seeds and all, hot from the sun. And harvesting it, that was half the story. You used long tongs, gloves, and patience. If you respected the thorns, you earned the sugar. In the Pacific Northwest, salmonberry syrup, elderberry preserves, huckleberries stirred over fire until they thickened into a jam that you didn't spread. You spooned with reverence. In the Southeast, persimmons dried until chewy like fruit leather. Bee balm tea, wild mint, and spice bush bark steeped into hot floral sips after a long meal. Imagine fresh dewberries. Crush them with a stone, add sumac, and cook it down in a clay bowl over an open flame. Imagine the scent. Unreal. Wood smoke, tart sugar, crushed sunlight. Pour it over roasted squash. Earthy, tangy, weirdly decadent. There were cornbread steamed in husks. Cattail pollen cakes pressed with fat and dried. Even candy made from maple sap boiled down over hours until it hardened like glass on cold stone. The technique wasn't missing. The sweetness just had to be earned. When people talk about indigenous foods, they all too often talk about sustenance or survival. But that is far from the whole story, because we also had flavor, indulgence. We had things that made kids smile and elders nod and guests feel cared for. Of course there was dessert. Here's the thing about food history. It's not about who did it first. It's about who kept doing it. You don't keep roasting camas bulbs for 2 days unless it works. You don't keep nixtamalizing corn unless someone tells you why. You don't crack open an agave or smoke a whole bison unless it feeds more than just the hunger. That's not just tradition. That's information. That's the system. Indigenous food systems are so much like modern day. They weren't just patchwork guesses. They were built with intention, patience, and time, like any Michelin star restaurant. The roasting pits, the fermentation pits, the salt harvesting, the slow, repetitive grinding of seeds into something edible, the labor, precision, design. It's not primitive or accidental or less developed. Just because the ingredients don't come from a store, it doesn't make the meal less complex. We bury so much knowledge under the idea of progress. We call food modern because it's packaged. We call cooking advanced when it uses a sous vide machine. But show me someone who can cook over an open fire, adjust for wind, altitude, and wood type, and still feed 100 people using nothing but what's growing nearby. That's not nostalgia. That's not primitive. That's mastery. The recipes survived because people did. Because someone passed down a taste, a memory. Because someone remembered what the cedar smoke was for. Because someone still eats wild onions in the spring. We don't have to guess what the past tasted like. We just have to listen to the people still cooking it. This wasn't a reenactment. It was a reminder of how much flavor lives in memory, of how much history lives in your hands. And if you ever want to taste it, really taste it, you don't need a time machine. You just need fire, a story, and a little patience. This has been Stratified. Thanks for being at the table.